What this is about is the greatest ripoff in history, the very way money and debt are created and controlled. This affects everyone on the planet. It is the basic cause of all our economic problems today. Until we recognize this, in every nation, nothing any national government does will fix the problem, and all of us will see mounting debts and sinking standards of living. Our children will inherit this mess, and it will get worse every single year.
This is the first time, I think, in history where mothers are saying to themselves, ooh, what do my kids have to look forward to? Maybe they shouldn't have kids.
The truth is that depressions are not normal. They are contrived. The truth is that nations don't need a national debt. The truth is that governments generally aren't printing money wildly. Governments are borrowing money wildly.
The bulk of money creation is made by banks.
The banks decide when and how much money they are going to produce, so to say. The money supply is out of control, out of any control.
When governments today borrow money from banks, basically you are just enslaving the rest of the economy, the people.
You need to create the money for the good of the people. It has to be a common good.
The new money coming into the economy starts as debt created by the banks. It's unsustainable.
The way the system is going now is it is going to destroy Western civilization as we have known it for the last century.
Legalized theft is what we now have with this monetary system.
This is quite different from the past, when money was created by the government.
There is no reason for governments to run the debt. It's a game of power, really.
The good news is we can fix this. It won't take a war or a revolution. It only takes a simple understanding of the problem and its simple solution. The truth is that anyone can understand what's going on. This is not rocket science. The truth is that those who are making money off this ripoff want to keep you confused. Confused about the basic facts of what your money is and who creates it. On Tuesday evening of November 22, 1910, just 2 days before Thanksgiving Day, a cold drizzle covered New York City with a foggy blanket. The sounds of an occasional passenger scurrying to catch a late train echoed across the marble floors of the new Hoboken, New Jersey train station. No one noticed the shiny Pullman car parked on the last track. Unlike the beat-up coach cars that the average person was familiar with, this long black beauty glistened in perfection. Its polished brass nameplate simply read, Aldrich. The car belonged to Senator Nelson Aldrich, one of the most powerful men in the United States Senate. By 10 p.m., most New Yorkers were tucked into their beds, but one group was on the move to climb aboard the Aldrich car that night. All the participants had been instructed to arrive separately and in utmost secrecy. All were instructed to be sure that none of New York City's voracious press were following them. Who were these men and what was their secretive mission? They were some of the wealthiest men in America, but more importantly, each of them represented the world's richest banking families. They were so well known that their comings and goings were frequently monitored by the New York newspapers, led by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. If news got out that the representatives of the money trust had assembled, questions would be asked, conclusions drawn, conclusions that could spoil years of careful preparation. The papers knew that the money trust was behind the economic booms and busts that had ravaged America since the Civil War. The entire nation had been sent into an uproar with the latest one, the Great Bank Panic of 1907. The public was demanding a solution. So, their goal this night was to assemble in secret, to write legislation which would be introduced in Congress, supposedly to control them, the money trust, to fix the problems they had created. But a single whistleblower could lead to a disastrous outbreak of populism and a potential end to the most lucrative monopoly ever devised in human history. Absolute control of the money supply of the fastest growing nation on earth. Their purpose was to maintain the fiction that America's banking panics were some sort of immutable cycle over which humans had no control. They called it the business cycle. Their solution, an omnipotent central bank, one which would pretend to operate in the public interest and under the public's control, but in reality would be a complete captive of the money trust. It was an audacious plan. The bankers had not dared to reconstruct a privately owned central bank in America since 1832, when President Jackson had labeled them a den of vipers and destroyed their last one, the second bank of the United States. There were 6 participants in the Aldrich car headed for Jekyll Island. 5 of the 6 represented the 3 great banking families, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans. The Jekyll Island Club did not have a large year-round population. The majority of the members arrived after Christmas and stayed through March. In other words, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, the place would be nearly deserted, with only a minimal staff of caretakers. It was the perfect place to meet in anonymity. Now let's take a look at these 3 great banking families to understand what they wanted. All 3 practiced extreme secrecy concerning their business activities. The Rothschilds are certainly the oldest of the big 3 banking families, and experts believe that they are the wealthiest. But estimates of the extent of their holdings are so shrouded in generations of secrecy that there are no reliable figures. We do know, however, that they have dominated European economics since the late 1700s. One of the greatest fortunes in history began in 1743 in Frankfurt, Germany, when a coin dealer named Amschel Bauer opened a counting house. He placed a sign over the door depicting a Roman eagle on a red shield. The shop became known as the Red Shield Firm, or in German, Rothschild. The Rothschilds were a Jewish family. Throughout Europe, Jews were forbidden by law from participating in most businesses or trades, so they naturally tended to provide for themselves through money lending and banking activities. Amschel taught his son, Mayer Rothschild, the secret of banking, leveraging, or multiplying money by a process known as fractional reserve lending. This practice continues to this day and is one of the 2 major causes of the world's economic problems. Mayer Rothschild soon learned that loaning money to governments and kings was more profitable than loaning to private individuals. Not only were the loans bigger, but they could be secured by the nation's taxes. Government borrowing is the second major problem with the world economy today. Mayer Rothschild had 5 sons. He sent them to the major capitals of Europe to open branch offices of the family banking business. This internationality gave the Rothschilds a major advantage over all other banking houses and allowed them protection from the political tides of individual nations. The Rothschilds found that encouraging a nation to borrow, have a national debt, was their most powerful tool. Once they could convince a nation to borrow, that nation quickly became addicted to borrowing. What most people don't understand to this day is that the negative effects of government borrowing are not felt for years down the road, the compounding interest problem. The result, the borrowing nation quickly found itself a political captive of the Rothschilds. If that nation tried to oppose the House of Rothschild, they would find that their loans would be called in and no new loans would be issued. That in itself would cause domestic turmoil. But in addition, the rivals of that nation would suddenly be given ample loans, a subtle yet powerful manipulative force in the affairs of nations, even today. The Rothschilds broke into dealings with European royalty here in 1769 in Wilhelmshohe, the palace of the wealthiest monarch in all of Europe, Prince William of Hesse-Kassel. At first, the Rothschilds were only helping William speculate in precious coins. But when war broke out between England and its American colonies, the Rothschilds became rich, brokering William's mercenary army, the Hessians, to go fight in America for the British. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte chased Prince William into exile. William sent 550,000 British pounds, a gigantic sum at the time, to one of Mayor Rothschild's 5 sons, Nathan, head of the London branch of the House of Rothschild, with instructions to buy consols, British government bonds, which paid a small but very reliable interest rate on British national debt. But instead of buying the bonds, Rothschild used the money for his own purposes. With Napoleon on the loose, the opportunities for highly profitable wartime investments were nearly limitless. After Napoleon's first defeat in 1813 and imprisonment on Elba, William returned to Wilhelmshaven. He summoned the Rothschilds and demanded his money back. The Rothschilds returned William's money with the 8% interest the British consuls would have paid him had the investment actually been made. But the Rothschilds kept all the vast wartime profits they had made using William's money. Napoleon rose to power in the bloody aftermath of the French Revolution. He wanted to improve economic conditions at home, so he opposed any government debt.
One has only to consider what loans can lead to in order to realize their danger. The hand that gives is above the hand that takes.
In 1800, he established an independent Bank of France and made himself its president. Insisting on no national debt was a difficult decision on Napoleon's part. France was broke. The French treasury had been emptied by the bloody French Revolution. But Napoleon knew that the Rothschilds would not rest as long as he was in power unless it was mutually beneficial. So he opened negotiations for a treaty with England by threatening to invade Holland, which was heavily in debt to the British. Always anxious to regain her lost colony, the British made a little-known counter-proposal to combine forces with Napoleon to take back America. The proposal was that England would get the industrial North and combine it with Canada. France would get the rural agricultural South. In hopes of feeding Napoleon's well-known ego, England would proclaim Napoleon the King of America. Napoleon quickly saw that the British would be getting the better half of this deal, and so made the plan public to the great embarrassment of the British. From that point on, there was no going back. Napoleon was the sworn enemy of the Rothschilds. Napoleon knew he had to go on the offensive, but he needed money to pay an army. Then he came up with an audacious plan. On April 30, 1803, he sold the vast Louisiana territory to the Americans for less than 3 cents per acre. A month later, England declared war on France, and Napoleon prepared to invade Britain, an invasion which would never occur. So off Napoleon went, conquering most of Europe with his military genius. He knew he had to install his own puppets in the Rothschild strongholds if he were to succeed. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschilds developed a legendary network of spies and couriers to smuggle gold bullion around Europe to support Napoleon's defeat. The Rothschilds' red shield symbol on a courier's saddlebags meant unfettered passage through most national checkpoints. Napoleon's final battle began here at Waterloo, Belgium, in the summer of 1815. Here, 300,000 men met in battle, representing 7 different nations, led by Napoleon on the one side and the Duke of Wellington on the other. Nathan Rothschild was prepared to make money no matter which way the battle went. He alerted his covert network to bring him news of the battle before anyone else could obtain it, so that he might play the British stock market to his maximum advantage. If Napoleon had been victorious, England, already deeply in debt to the Rothschilds, would be in even greater financial trouble than before.
With her power and prestige damaged, the government would be unable to borrow more money through the sale of bonds, and the value of the outstanding bonds would plummet. British bonds, known as consols or gilts, would flood into the market before they became worthless. Nathan Rothschild got the news a full 24 hours ahead of Wellington's own courier. Everyone knew that Rothschild was the largest investor in British consols. He looked dejected. Then he started selling. Rumors quickly swirled that Wellington had been defeated and Rothschild had received first word of the defeat. Soon everyone began selling their consols, and the price collapse became a stampede. Then Rothschild, in one quick move, reversed his position and bought the entire market in consols for pennies on the dollar. In just a few hours, he bought England's entire national debt for a tiny fraction of its worth. By cooperating within the family using fractional reserve banking techniques, the Rothschild banks grew unbelievably wealthy. By the mid-1800s, they dominated all European banking and were certainly the wealthiest family in the world. Most of the nobility of Europe became deeply indebted to them, making any effective control an impossibility. By 1850, James Rothschild, the heir of the French branch of the family, was said to be worth 600 million French francs, 150 million more than all the other bankers in France put together. No fortune in America at that time equaled even 1 year's income of James. In 1961, biographer Frederick Morton wrote of the House of Rothschild that they had conquered the world more thoroughly, more cunningly, and much more lastingly than all the Caesars before. But the Rothschilds were not the first to practice the two great evils of banking, fractional reserve lending and encouraging a national debt. 900 years ago, goldsmiths served as the first bankers in England because they had large, secure vaults where they stored their gold as well as the gold of others. Most people simply left their gold in the goldsmith's vault, and the goldsmith wrote out paper receipts for their gold. Soon, people started trading these receipts as money. However, the goldsmiths soon learned two very important ways to abuse their new system. First of all, they discovered that on average, only about 10% of the depositors actually wanted their gold back at any one time. So if they were dishonest, they could print 10 paper receipts for every 1 ounce of gold in their vault. Then they could lend these extra receipts out to people. What a scam! So if they were lending out at 6% per year, their profit wouldn't just be 6% per year, it would really be 10 times that, or 60% per year. In reality, this is called fractional reserve lending, but it was nothing but counterfeiting. But fractional reserve lending not only made the goldsmiths rich, it gave them control over the quantity of money in the entire economy. What good was that? By acting in concert with other goldsmiths, if they refused to lend out their gold receipts and call in their old loans, it caused a depression. The second thing the goldsmiths learned was that if they could get the king to borrow from them, then soon the king would become dependent on these loans being renewed time and time again. Once the king was dependent on new loans, the goldsmiths could make sure that no new laws would ever be passed which would harm their counterfeiting business, the most lucrative business in the history of humanity.
Just think of it, a system where some people, because they have a special license to do it, can lend the same money 5, 10, 15, or 20 times to that many different people or companies or governments and collect interest on it from each one of them. Well, this is just grand larceny.
Around 1100 AD, the son of William the Conqueror, Henry I, got tired of the goldsmiths owning everything and even controlling the political process by being in control of the quantity of money. So he created a totally unique form of money called tally sticks that eventually took the money power away from the goldsmiths. Tally sticks initially were a record of semi-annual tax payments. Notches of a certain size were cut into the stick to represent the amount. Then the stick was split lengthwise, and the king would keep one half as a receipt and a way to prevent counterfeiting. But since taxes were a necessity, tally sticks began circulating as a form of money because everyone needed them. They didn't replace gold coins. These have always been the money of the rich. But for the poor farmer, taking a pocketful of small tally sticks to market to buy and sell food was much easier than it was to take your cow and try to barter for the needed goods. It's not easy to make change with a cow. Having tally sticks as another form of money had the effect of keeping the English economy growing steadily for hundreds of years by keeping the money power out of the hands of the bankers, who always thrive off creating bubbles and busts, which they call the business cycle, as though it was somehow connected to the inalterable celestial motions of Uranus.
The banks were creating too much credit, and they created a bubble, and the bubbles burst, and now the pain goes to the people.
In other words, economic turmoil always benefits the bankers, while economic stability benefits small businesses, the middle class, the nation as a whole, and freedom in general. Some authors, anxious to claim that only gold has provided stability in the money supply, ignore this ability of the bankers to monopolize the supply of gold and thereby completely control the national economy. How? By either lending the receipts out liberally, flooding the market with their fake paper gold receipts, or hoarding it all so that there is no money in the system. These same authors have claimed that tallies weren't a real money system because they were only used for very large transactions. But that's just not the case. According to the world's leading authority on tally sticks, John Keyworth, curator of the Bank of England Museum, the man in charge of Britain's remaining tally stick collection.
In the Middle Ages, the average size was reckoned to be the length from the tip of his thumb to the tip of his forefinger, quite short. Because if you think of it in terms of this is £6,000. That means it's a huge, huge sum of money.
So the wider the spacing, the larger the
larger the amount. But it was a prescribed distance. It was an inch, and I think half an inch for hundreds and a quarter of an inch for tens. And then it became little lines drawn across with a saw.
In 1694, the bankers were finally able to convince the British Parliament to allow a privately owned central bank. The idea, of course, was to eventually get the government borrowing money from the bankers again. Still, it took an entire generation to discontinue the use of tally sticks. They had worked so well for over 600 years. During this period, England, an island with few natural resources, had become the mightiest power on earth. Serfdom had been outlawed and the arts and culture flourished. But tally sticks got their revenge. They were stored in the basement of the Parliament building, known as Westminster, for many years. The bankers, now firmly in control of the English economy, did not want any remnant of this successful debt-free money system to remain in the public memory. So in 1834, they ordered all the tallies to be secretly burned in a large basement coal stove that heated the building. On the evening of October 16, 1834, the burning began after most of the workers had left for the day. However, the fire got so hot that it broke through the floor above and quickly spread, gutting most of the complex and attracting massive crowds in downtown London. The final revenge of the mistreated and misunderstood tally stick. Within 75 years of the founding of the Bank of England, the interest payments on England's national debt consumed the majority of its budget. As a result, England needed to squeeze more and more money from all her colonies. In British America, the result was the American Revolution.
The money and banking system that we have, and certainly in the West, is nothing but a perpetuation of a scam, an infinitely silly system that was developed by the goldsmiths of Lombard Street in London more than three centuries ago.
Although America won its freedom in 1783 militarily, the money masters knew they could reclaim the former colony by convincing the government to borrow, to create a national debt, just as they had in England with the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694. What better way to bring the freedom-loving Americans back under control than to addict the American government to debt? Human nature is to take any loan offered. In the case of politicians, the attraction is clear. If a politician can borrow, they will spend more on their constituents without having to raise their taxes and thereby get reelected. That's why government borrowing is the most dangerous force on the planet, dangerous to human freedom, that is. However, the true statesmen of the great American experiment in political freedom were very aware of the problem. How to deal with the threat posed by the wealthy bankers, mostly with direct ties to the Bank of England, was the cause of much debate. One of the main authors of the U.S. Constitution was Gouverneur Morris. Morris wrote large sections of the Constitution. Surprisingly, Morris himself, an aristocrat, explained in a letter to James Madison during the debate on the contents of the Constitution what the relationship between the new freedom-loving nation and its bankers should be on July 2nd, 1787.
The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did. They always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere, if we do not, by the power of government, keep them in their proper spheres.
Morris wasn't talking about taking their money. He wasn't talking about outlawing banks or banking. He merely wanted to figure out a way to keep the bankers and their money out of controlling the political process. Down through the decades, the battle for the monetary soul of America has raged. The issues are remarkably the same, yet this battle is nowhere recounted in school texts on American history. A generation later, former President Thomas Jefferson wrote to then President James Monroe in January of 1815.
The dominion of the banks must be broken, or it will break us.
Remarkably, over a century later, populist William Jennings Bryan said basically the same thing in his Cross of Gold speech in 1896.
The bankers tell us that this issue of money is a function of the bank, and that the government ought to go out of the banking business. I stand with Jefferson rather than with them and say that the issue of money is a function of the government, and that the bank should go out of the governing business.
In another 1815 letter, Jefferson wrote to then Treasury Secretary Gallatin.
The Treasury, lacking confidence in the country, delivered itself bound hand and foot to bold and bankrupt bankers pretending to have money, whom it could have crushed at any moment.
If they'd done what Jefferson and wanted them to do, and they wouldn't have any government debt. They could be debt-free. And that's the way it should have been. And the American people have been paying for it ever since.
Whenever the banking sector, particularly the large banks, have gained control of the money supply, then we always have had crises, we always have had inflation.
In the entire history of this battle over financial control of America, no one defeated this British invention of privately owned central banking more courageously than President Andrew Jackson. Writing in 1834, Jackson explained that there were only two choices in the basic forms of governance: a republic where power is maximally decentralized, or a plutocracy where it is maximally centralized.
It is not in a splendid government supported by powerful monopolies and aristocratic establishments that they will find happiness or their liberties protected, but in a plain system, void of pomp, protecting all and granting favors to none.
By 1835, Jackson was able to pay off the last of the bonds, thereby completely eliminating the American national debt, the only president to do so. 3 weeks later, an assassin by the name of Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter from England, fired 2 flintlock pistols at Jackson at close range as he was leaving the capital. The pistols, however, misfired. It was the first ever attempt to kill a sitting president. After the assassination attempt, Lawrence's pistols were tested and retested and performed perfectly each time. This led many to see Jackson's survival as an act of divine providence, protecting both he and his rapidly expanding new nation. When Jackson left office in 1837, America was without debt. But what Jackson failed to do was install a permanent remedy to government borrowing and unlimited money creation by private banks. Jackson had left America on the gold money system. This automatically leaves the control over the quantity of a nation's money to who? The owners of gold, the largest banks, both domestically and, most importantly, internationally. After Jackson left office, the bankers could easily deepen the Depression by withdrawing their loans from the general public and sharply contracting the money supply. Yes, gold was the currency of the day, but currency is just a small portion of a national money supply. Loans by banks are a much larger portion of a nation's money supply. So despite Jackson's hard money system, the banks were able to plunge America into a deep depression from 1837 into the 1840s. That's why the 1840s became known as the Hungry 40s. Money was so scarce that even state governments began defaulting on their state bonds, sold to Europeans by bond dealers in London. Maryland, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, Indiana, Arkansas, and Michigan, as well as the Florida Territory, all defaulted. In fact, Mississippi today is still in default from these bonds floated in the 1830s. Although Jackson had paid off the national debt on a gold money system, the Depression forced the next president, Martin Van Buren, to immediately begin borrowing again. Had Van Buren chosen to return to issuing debt-free government currency and made gold coin a complementary currency, then the power of the bankers would have been broken, but he did not. Therefore, by the end of 1837, the national debt again rose to over $3 million. The next year, it rose to $10 million. In 1842, in order to end the Depression, Treasury officials visited James Rothschild at his mansion outside Paris, Chateau Ferrier, seeking a loan for the United States. Rothschild, incensed by the defeat of the Second Bank, thundered,
"Tell your colleagues that you have seen the man who is at the head of the finances of Europe, and that he has told you that they cannot borrow a dollar. Not a dollar."
By the end of 1842, the U.S. national debt had doubled again to $20 million. 7 years later, at the end of 1849, it had tripled to $63 million. 12 years later, in 1861, the bankers mounted another plan to divide the United States north and south by a civil war, one which had been predicted accurately by Jackson 24 years earlier. With the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln on March 4, 1861, the nation had another president who was determined to fight the Rothschilds for the heart and soul of the great American political experiment in maximizing human freedom. Lincoln understood the roots of the battle. On his way to the inauguration, he stopped at Independence Hall in Philadelphia and told an audience that the Declaration of Independence gave
liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time.
The very next month, the first shots were fired here at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, after 7 southern states seceded from the Union. The American Civil War was on. The bankers wanted the South to win, or at least to the point of a stalemate, keeping the nation permanently divided. Lincoln needed money to keep the nation together, so he went to New York to try to secure the necessary loans from the big bankers. The bankers demanded an interest rate of as much as 36%. Then Lincoln came up with the most brilliant idea of his presidency. He decided to return to America's colonial monetary roots, have the government issue their own money. As Congressman E.G. Spalding from Buffalo, New York, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, explained it,
"Why then should we go into Wall Street begging for money? Their money is not as secure as government money. I am unwilling that this government should be left in the hands of any class of men, bankers, or moneylenders, however respectable or patriotic they may be.
So that is exactly what Lincoln did. From 1862 to 1865, Congress authorized the printing of $450 million of new bills that he called U.S. notes. To distinguish them from debt-based money, he had them printed in green ink on the back and a red seal on the front. That is why the notes were called greenbacks. Since Congress had declared greenbacks to be legal tender for all debts, Lincoln was able to pay his troops and buy their supplies with this new money, all created at no interest to the federal government. Within 4 days of the passage of the law authorizing greenbacks, bankers met in convention in Washington, D.C. to discuss the situation. It was agreed that greenbacks would surely be their ruination. Something had to be done. They circulated a private letter known as the Hazard Circular amongst themselves and their wealthiest stockholders, which was later placed into the historical record by Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh. The Hazard Circular proclaimed that
it will not do to allow the greenback, as it is called, to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that. But we can control the bonds, and through them the bank issues.
with an adequate debt-free money supply created completely in the public interest, Lincoln won the Civil War and reunited the nation. His chief economic advisor was the greatest economist of his day, Henry C. Carey, the founder of what would become known as the American School of Economics. In a letter to the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Carey explained the benefits of Lincoln's greenbacks on the nation just 3 months before the South surrendered and Lincoln was assassinated.
That for the first time, too, in the history of the world, there has been presented a community in which nearly all business was done for cash and in which debt had scarcely an existence.
Lincoln, of course, had the right idea. And of course, there have been a lot of people in the United States that have said that they should follow his example and create greenbacks rather than having to borrow money from a bunch of vultures on Wall Street to take advantage of everyone in sight, and who are nothing but really bloodsuckers if you look at it in the correct language, and get out from under this horrible, insane kind of albatross that is around the neck of ordinary people and has been for so long.
As MIT professor Dr. Davis Rich Dewey would write 40 years after Lincoln's issuance of greenbacks in his Financial History of the United States, the underlying idea in the greenback philosophy is that the issue of currency is a function of government, a sovereign right which ought not to be delegated to corporations. Throughout the Civil War, the bankers and their bought politicians continued to attack the greenbacks. Bond dealers convinced Congress to not issue further greenbacks to completely finance the war effort. So U.S. government bonds were offered for sale in London, thereby running up the national debt.
If our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. It is absurd to say our country can issue 30 million in bonds and not 30 million in currency. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers, and the other helps the people.
The solution is very simple. Don't issue government bonds. What are they doing issuing government bonds?
And who was the London-based chief financial agent selling these bonds for the Union government? None other than Junius Morgan in London and his 24-year-old son, budding financier J.P. Morgan, known in the family as Pierpont. 2 years later, in the summer of 1863, Pierpont Morgan, facing conscription to fight in the Union Army, paid a substitute $300 to take his place in war. A notation in the firm's books showed he spent $300 on cigars in 1863 alone, exactly the cost of that substitute soldier. Late in 1863, he and Edward Ketchum began quietly buying gold. By mid-October, they dumped over $1 million of gold suddenly on the London market, creating a temporary gold shortage in New York. This drove up the price of gold in New York, and Morgan and Ketchum were able to sell the rest of their gold at a tidy profit, some $66,000 each. Pierpoint's father, Junius, as a proud American in London, was outraged and threatened to sever all business ties with his own son because this action constituted evidence of greed. Meanwhile, in Washington, bankers were trying to put an end to greenback money permanently. In February 1863, Congress passed the National Bank Act. This act didn't kill greenbacks, but it allowed for the first time a system of federally chartered banks with permission to lend bank-created banknotes into the money supply as a complementary currency, but all as a debt. To further assist the new national banks, incredibly, they were given a virtual tax-free status. In fact, these national banks remain today and are denoted by the suffix N.A, National Banking Association. For example, Bank of America N.A. or Citibank N.A. means their origin was as the result of this 1863 National Bank Act. Within 2 years, by the end of the Civil War, there were 4 times as many debt-backed U.S. banknotes in circulation as there were debt-free U.S. notes, greenbacks. Private banks now had the money power, and Congress has not been able to wrest it from them ever since. So, from that point on, since most money was created out of debt, it would be impossible under this system for the federal government to ever get out of debt. As historian John Kenneth Galbraith put it,
in numerous years following the war, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not, however, pay off its debt, retire its securities, because to do so meant there would be no bonds to back the national bank notes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply.
In 1864, shortly before Lincoln was murdered, his former Secretary of Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, bemoaned his role in helping secure the passage of the National Banking Act only 1 year earlier.
My agency in promoting the passage of the National Banking Act was the greatest financial mistake in my life. It has built up a monopoly that affects every interest in the country. It should be repealed.
On April 14, 1865, 41 days after his second inauguration, and just 5 days after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. After the death of President Lincoln, the bankers continued to reassert their control over America's money. This was no easy task. Lincoln's greenbacks, just like England's debt-free tally sticks, were generally popular, and their existence had let the genie out of the bottle. The public was becoming accustomed to government-issued debt-free money and the debt-free prosperity they brought to the nation. On April 12, 1866, nearly 1 year to the day of Lincoln's assassination, Congress passed the Contraction Act, authorizing the Secretary of Treasury to begin to retire the greenbacks in circulation and to contract the money supply. Well, as it turned out, this became the mother of all depressions. In 1866, there was $1.8 billion in currency in circulation in the United States, about $50.46 per capita. In 1867 alone, $500 million was removed from the U.S. money supply. But that wasn't enough. The big banks wanted complete control over the nation's money by putting America on a gold-only money system. In 1873, President Grant signed the Coinage Act into law, which stopped the minting of silver dollars. The effect was an immediate depression with high unemployment, falling prices, and bank failures. Wages dropped 24%. Unemployment soared to 14%, and 1/4 of American railroads went bankrupt. Demonetizing silver was decried by the newspapers as the crime of '73. By 1876, America's money supply was reduced to only $600 million. In other words, 2/3 of America's money had been called in by the bankers. Incredibly, only $13.33 per capita remained in circulation. Riots broke out from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The torches of starving vandals lit up the sky. To quell the violence, Congress created the United States Silver Commission to study the crime of '73 situation. Their report compared the demonetization of silver to the deflation of the Roman era.
The disaster of the Dark Ages was caused by decreasing money and falling prices. It is universally conceded that falling prices result from the contraction of the money volume.
So why did the bill pass Congress? Senator Bogey of Missouri put it this way.
Why the Act of 1873, which forbids the coinage of the silver dollar, was passed, no one at this day can give a good reason.
And who was behind the deception to limit the amount of money in circulation and centralize money into the hands of a few of the biggest bankers? Senator Beck of Kentucky told the committee on January 10, 1878, the bondholders, the holders of the national debt.
I know that the bondholders and monopolists of this country are seeking to destroy all the industries of this people in their greed to enhance the value of their gold. I know the Act of 1873 did more than all else to accomplish that result.
What's so important about how money was withdrawn from the U.S. money supply? Because the real cause of depressions is deliberate contractions of the money supply by big bankers in order to get what they want politically, the very thing that King Henry of England was trying to prevent when he created tally sticks in 1100 A.D. The big bankers were bankrupting America merely by taking all the money over which they had exclusive control out of the system. This is not difficult to understand. No money in the system means no money for people, and the only money is the gold money of the bankers. Congress finally passed the Bland-Allison Act in 1878, which authorized the minting again of silver coinage. But President Rutherford Hayes vetoed it. Hayes was closely allied to the big banks. He explained his veto this way.
Expediency and justice both demand an honest currency.
Of course, throughout history, gold money has always been called honest money by those who own a lot of the gold. So great was the pressure that Congress quickly overrode the Hayes veto, and soon some silver coinage began to flow back into the U.S. economy. These were the first issues of the famous Morgan silver dollars. About this time in 1879, J.P. Morgan, at age 42, began to come into his own as the head of the American branch of the family firm. Morgan's firms in London and New York were at the forefront of the sale of bonds in Europe to fund America's expansion westward. But with America's tradition of state-chartered banks, the national banks were quickly losing control. By 1891, the bankers were ready to unleash additional monetary restrictions. Their methods and motives were laid out with shocking clarity in a memo sent out by the American Bankers Association, the ABA, in 1891. Notice that this memo called for bankers to create a depression on a certain date, 3 years in the future.
On September 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well, at our own price. Then the farmers will become tenants, as in England.
As the impending planned depression date drew nearer, another memo was issued to bankers nationwide on March 11, 1893. Known as the Panic Circular, it was issued under the name of the American Bankers Association and was subsequently published in many newspapers. The Panic Circular urged all national banks to take all the silver coins and silver certificates, as well as the greenbacks, out of circulation. In other words, to reestablish a gold-only money system.
Silver certificates and treasury bonds, that is to say all the government's money, must be retired, and interest-bearing national banknotes made the only money. You will at once retire 1/3 of your circulation, your paper money, and call in 1/2 of your loans. Be careful to make a monetary emergency among your patrons, especially among influential businessmen. The future of our debt-based money system depends upon immediate action, as there is an increasing sentiment in favor of government legal tender notes and silver coinage.
Sure enough, the latest depression began in 1893 with what historians now call the Panic of 1893. It all started when European investors demanded payment only in gold, not silver coin, quickly draining gold reserves in the U.S. Again, America was being forced by the Europeans onto a gold-only money system. The results were as inevitable as before. A deep depression quickly set in as the major holders of gold in Europe choked the life out of the American economy. By the 1896 presidential campaign, opposition to the bankers' monopoly on money had reached a fever pitch. Unlike today, Americans understood much more completely the cause of the problem. A Greenback party had developed and run congressional candidates as well as presidential candidates in 1876, 1880, and 1884, but never won more than 3.3% of the vote. So when a virtually unknown congressman from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan, burst upon the scene campaigning on reversing the crime of '73 by legalizing the minting of silver dollars freely once again, he was swept into the nomination to run as the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1896, Bryan made an emotional speech entitled "Crown of Thorns and Cross of Gold." Bryan's speech was so powerful that it propelled him from relative obscurity to the presidential nomination on the 5th ballot at the tender age of 36. Bryan explained why monetary reform was and will always be the most important issue in the politics of every nation.
When we have restored the money of the Constitution, all other necessary reforms will be possible. And until that is done, there is no reform that can be accomplished.
Amazingly, years later, Thomas Edison captured Bryan's actual voice, recreating portions of this famous speech with the advent of his recording technology. Bryan concluded his speech with its namesake line, obliterating for all time the notion that a gold money system promoted freedom for the middle class.
They will search the pages of history in vain to find a single instance where the common people of any land have ever declared themselves in favor of the gold standard. They can find where the holders of fixed investments have declared for a gold standard, but not where the masses have. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold."
In fact, the gold standard and its 30-year-long restrictive impact on the money supply had become so unpopular that even most Republicans had come out against it. So Bryan became the silver money candidate, running against Republican William McKinley, the gold money candidate. Remember, silver wasn't the perfect solution, but the average person was so desperate for some sort of cash money to spend that they flocked to the Bryan campaign. Bryan scared the financial community, who painted him as a communist. The day after Bryan's nomination, 150 members of the New York Stock Exchange, waving American flags, marched to the rostrum of the Chicago Democratic Convention and put on McKinley buttons and shouted,
"Down with the red flag, up with the stars and stripes."
Just a year earlier, J.P. Morgan had made his feelings on a gold money system clear in a letter to his brother.
As a man of sense, I am a gold bug, and support a gold bug government and gold bug society. As a man of the world, I like confusion, anarchy, and war.
J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds, through their New York agent, August Belmont, contributed to the McKinley campaign mightily. But even more importantly, they had financed a rescue of the nation's most important newspaper by loaning the gold-loving owner of the Chattanooga Times, Adolph Oakes, sufficient money to buy the New York Times.
Rumors that Morgan owned the New York Times haunted the paper and the banker for years.
As a result, the 1896 campaign was among the most fiercely contested presidential races in American history. The McKinley campaign outspent Bryan by a 5-to-1 margin. But the real spending was even more. McKinley did not go around the nation campaigning like Bryan did. He stayed at home in Ohio, and the J.P. Morgan-dominated railroads brought the voters to him with most expenses paid. Bryan's strategy was to take his political campaign on the road. Bryan invented the National Stumping Tour. He made over 500 speeches in 27 states during the 4-month campaign. Across the nation, tens of thousands of Americans rallied around Bryan's appearances with torchlight parades. On November 3rd, McKinley defeated Bryan by an electoral college margin of 271 to 176. But the Silver Democrats suffered major losses in both Congress and the many state legislatures as well, sealing the fate of the populist revolt for at least a century. The sweeping Republican victory meant a return to an uncontested gold standard and the domination of big business. From this point on, government-issued debt-free money would never again regain a significant political following in the United States. So what did the big three banking families want at the Jekyll Island meeting? Central control over the American money supply. By the turn of the century, the biggest New York banks could control less than half of the American money supply. States were still chartering their own banks, and the center of financial gravity was rapidly shifting westward, away from New York. Something had to be done to bring it all under one central control point back in New York. President McKinley was assassinated about 6 months into his second administration, and the bombastic Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president to ever hold office at age 42. Just 1 year in office, Roosevelt, aware that the money trust was the cause of most of the economic problems, revived the Sherman Antitrust Act. He went after a huge banker conglomerate called Northern Securities Company, a giant combine of railroads owned by J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Edward H. Harriman, and James Hill. During the following 7 years, Roosevelt pursued his trust-busting policies by bringing suit against 43 other major corporations. After Roosevelt's election in 1904, he increased the pressure on the money trust again. By 1907, Morgan and the other money changers had had enough. First, they created a panic by attacking Morgan's primary Wall Street rival, the Heinz-Morse Group, the holders of considerable banking, mining, steel, and shipping interests. By cleverly manipulating the stock market, the Rockefellers drove down the stock of Heinz's Union Copper Company from as high as $60 a share down to $10 a share. In addition, Rockefeller spread the rumor that not only were Heinz Copper interests in trouble, but also Heinz banks as well. J.P. Morgan then jumped in, predicting that he thought the Knickerbocker Trust Company would be the first Heinz bank to go under. Before long, the panic had engulfed America. Thousands of banks were vastly overextended, some having maintained less than 1% reserves. The weaker banks went under first, closing their doors to depositors. Now, the American people were really angry. 40 years on the financial roller coaster had worn thin. Americans desperately wanted safe banks that they could entrust with their money. At this critical moment, J.P. Morgan staged a brilliant public relations coup with a very profitable solution. He offered to salvage the last Heinz Bank, the Trust Company of America, if it would sell him their valuable Tennessee Coal and Iron Company for a small fraction of its real value. Although the proposal violated U.S. antitrust laws, the country was so desperate that the deal was still approved by Washington. By 1908, the panic was over, and Morgan was seen as a hero for saving the nation from a crisis he had not only created but also profited from. As incredible as it may seem, the president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, actually applauded Morgan's efforts.
All this trouble, the 1907 Depression, could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country.
The real purposes for the repeated crashes since the Civil War had been threefold. To concentrate more of America's rapidly developing wealth into the hands of a super-rich elite by the roller coaster effect, whereby booms and busts generate bankruptcies and foreclosures. To make the independent, decentralized banking system look unstable. And finally, to make people so desperate for monetary security that they would be ready to accept practically any solution, namely the institution of a new central bank. As mainline economics textbooks would later verify, the creation of the Federal Reserve System was a direct effect of the panic of 1907.
It sprang from the panic of 1907, with its alarming epidemic of bank failures.
Minnesota Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. later explained that the panic of 1907 was the method by which
those not favorable to the money trust could be squeezed out of business, and the people frightened into demanding changes in the banking and currency laws which the money trust would frame.
The stage was now set for the introduction of America's fourth attempt at central banking. However, the public was angry. Roosevelt had been politically embarrassed by the panic of 1907, so he created the National Monetary Commission in 1908 to study the problem of monetary instability in response to the public outrage. Roosevelt then suddenly retired from the political scene, declining to run for president again. He threw his political support to his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Later that year, Taft beat William Jennings Bryan in Bryan's third and final presidential run, and Roosevelt disappeared from the rough and tumble of politics. He took off on an African safari and other world globetrotting. Taft was supposed to be the big banker's candidate. However, so great was the political outrage against the bankers that Taft initiated 90 trust-busting prosecutions for violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act, including one against U.S. Steel, which was now owned by J.P. Morgan. The bankers knew they were in trouble, thanks in large part to an honest press led by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Public outrage was affecting their political control over the nation. They knew that they had only a relatively brief window of time to propose a legislative solution that would allow them to increase their control, yet disguise it as a reform truly in the public interest. So, 2 days before Thanksgiving, on November 22, 1910, off they went to Jekyll Island. Secrecy was essential. If the newspapers found out about the meeting before the legislation could be rushed through Congress, all could be lost in a tidal wave of genuine monetary reform that might permanently remold the money power to actually serve the public interest. Eventually, the story would leak out, but too late to do any harm. In 1916, the first Inside Look was published by Leslie's Weekly. It was written by a financial reporter by the name of B.C. Forbes, who later founded Forbes magazine. After 10 days, the group dispersed. Senator Aldrich returned to Washington with the new central bank plan. Early in 1912, Aldrich presented the Aldrich Bill to Congress. Never before had a central bank sought such complete control over the banks of a nation and its supply of money. What was looming over the financial horizon was a debt monster, far bigger and more destructive than anything proposed before. According to Congressman Lindbergh, Aldrich's Monetary Commission
spent over $300,000 in order to learn how to form a plan by which to create a greater money trust, and it afterwards recommended to Congress to give this proposed trust a 50-year charter by means of which it could rob and plunder all humanity.
Unfortunately for Morgan and the other bankers, Senator Aldrich was already well known as the bankers' favorite senator in Congress. Consequently, the Aldrich bill died for lack of support in Congress. But that didn't stop the bankers. Within weeks, a new initiative was rolled out, complete with the most lavishly funded public relations campaign in history. The big New York banks, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, etc., contributed to a $5 million educational fund to finance professors at respected universities to endorse the new concept. An organization called the National Citizens League was formed under the personal guidance of Paul Warburg. But there were other initiatives as well. Funding was shuttled to the emerging schools of economics around the nation. As Gail Braith explained it,
under Aldrich's direction, a score or more of studies of monetary institutions in the United States, and more particularly in other countries, were commissioned from the emergent economics profession.
Another academic called in to defend the central bank concept of the Aldrich bill was the president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson, who was also a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation. Wilson embraced John D. Rockefeller's maxim, "Competition is sin," along with the idea of a central bank. Anti-money trust members of Congress impaneled a committee to investigate the 1907 panic. It was called the Peugeot Committee. In December 1912, J.P. Morgan was called by the Peugeot Committee to testify for 2 days. Also summoned before the Peugeot Committee was William Rockefeller, but Rockefeller evaded the U.S. Marshals trying to serve the congressional subpoena in July of 1912. Rockefeller's lawyer finally accepted the subpoena, ordering him to testify on January 13th. Rockefeller had endured several throat operations, and his attorney claimed testifying might kill him, so the committee agreed to come to Jekyll Island to take the testimony. The inquiry started on February 7, 1913, here in his apartment in Sanssouci, situated on the second floor between the Jekyll Island clubhouse on the north side and his 12,000 square foot cottage, Indian Mound, to the south. But his testimony didn't last long. A few minutes into his testimony, after only 4 preliminary questions, Rockefeller started coughing violently, and his physician insisted on a halt to the proceedings, lest his life be jeopardized. The committee bought it and left with zero information. So in the end, the Peugeot Committee accomplished very little other than to whip up public support for the very reform that the bankers actually wanted, the passage of the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913.
The legislation was the biggest heist in the history of humanity.
Although the bill appeared to spread out power through 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, in reality, the bill created just another privately owned central bank. The stock would be owned by all the national banks in the country, which in turn would be owned by their private stockholders. The Fed would be no more federal than Federal Express. Furthermore, federal courts have ruled that the Fed is a private corporation. So how did it work out? Did this private corporation, cleverly disguised to look like a public institution pretending to operate in the public interest, save America from the painful booms and busts of the dreaded business cycle? Well, less than 16 years after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, on October 29, 1929, the New York stock market crashed, dragging the rest of the world into the deepest, most long-lasting depression of the 20th century. International trade decreased by 50%. Unemployment in the U.S. rose to 25%, and in some countries as high as 33%. So was it an accident, or was it just that old wascally business cycle acting up again? According to Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, it was deliberate. The Fed could have stopped the Depression at any time by pumping money into the system. But instead, they let the money supply decline by 33%, sending most banks into bankruptcy. Friedman put it this way in his 1996 interview with National Public Radio.
The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933.
I don't think there's ever been a recession or a depression that was necessary. A lot of people lose their homes, their farms, and their jobs, and all unnecessarily.
This is what we have today, and unless we break its stranglehold over the nations of the world, humankind's cherished vision of freedom will be lost forever, and the very existence of humanity itself may be threatened. Today's Fed is nothing but a private monopoly over the nation's money. It pretends to be able to control how much money banks create out of nothing as loans. But as we found out during the 2008 congressional hearings, instead of lending out only 10 times as much money as they actually had, the biggest banks were lending out 50 times as much or more. Why haven't we heard this before? Why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't the root of our economic problems taught in every classroom around the world? Because the three major pathways of truthfully informing the public have been blocked by those who make money off the debt money system. There is now no penalty for a politician selling his soul to bankers. The vast majority of President Obama's top campaign contributors were the biggest banks.
I've now been in 57 states. I think one left to go.
The same goes for the Republican nominee in 2012, Mitt Romney.
Most of the major political parties are financed by the banks in a certain way, what we call on-call loans, okay? These are short terms that become long terms, because they are not called. They are there to make sure that the parties behave and do whatever the banks want. 60 days mostly, or 90 days sometimes. But anyway, you know, the political leader doesn't know when the bank will decide to call on the loan. So he just has to do what he thinks the bank wants him to do, and sometimes they also call them to the banks and tell them what they want them to do.
And how significant are these loans? Are they just little loans, or are they big loans?
No, we are talking about loans of sometimes tens of millions of dollars, and it is something like 3 times or 5 times the assets of the political party. So
calling in all these loans would break these political parties, and they know it.
Of course, of course.
So this is a significant power.
This is not a significant power, this is an absolute power. It is well known here in Israel that the parties do whatever they want, except touching the bank system too much.
So what do you think we should do about this?
This needs a very large public support, because a politician takes the money in order to be elected. And as long as the public doesn't understand this game, and the politician thinks that the money is most important than the knowledge of the public, he will take the money and he will be voted.
So we need a new crop of politicians who will tell us the truth about how money is created and in whose benefit.
Yesterday, a judge approved the settlement with SAC Capital, a $602 million fine for civil insider trading. One asks whether $602 million fine is likely to have much effect. That the owner and CEO of SAC Capital took home last year in compensation $1.4 billion personally. So I checked what Stephen A. Cohen, his political engagement this past year, and he gave $217,000 in campaign contributions. Now this is a pittance from the point of view of his wealth, obviously, as a share of $1.4 billion paycheck. But $217,000 with our cheapskate politicians actually goes a long way to making sure that Mr. Cohen will be very well treated by his senators and by others who are giving ample protection. The financial markets are the #1 campaign contributors in the U.S. system now. We have a corrupt politics to the core, I'm afraid to say.
What happens is that ultimately the one who creates money controls the political structure. So if you let the bank to create money for the nation, over time you would find the bank controlling the resources and the political structure or power in the country.
Seems strange that that community will stand for that when, with a bit of political will, it could issue its own debt-free money supply.
So how about the economics academic community in the United States? Surely professors of economics have their academic freedom, the continual search for the truth, protected by what's called tenure. Tenure is where a professor can't be fired for their political opinions.
Tenure started around 1900 and worked well for the first 70 years or so. But by the mid-1990s, things had changed. In order to hide the upcoming failings of the old debt money system, the Federal Reserve began a substantial program of consultants, visiting scholars, alumni, and staff economists that today so thoroughly dominates the field of economics that real criticism of the central bank and its debt money system has become a career liability, or when it comes to a reputable economics journal, an impossibility. At the prestigious Journal of Monetary Economics, more than half of the editorial board members are currently on the Fed payroll, and the rest have been in the past. The Fed's Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. employs 220 PhD economists. The 12 regional banks employ scores more. In 2009, the last year figures were available, the Fed spent $433 million on experts researching monetary and economic policy. If that isn't bad enough, the Fed has all the pathways to all the major economics journals blocked as well. In a recent survey of the 7 top journals, 84 of the 190 editorial board members were affiliated with the Federal Reserve in one way or another. According to Joshua Rosner, a Wall Street analyst who correctly called the 2008 meltdown,
"The Fed has a lock on the economics world. There is no room for other views. The only way you can actually get in a journal is by subscribing to the views of one of the journals."
But it's not all about the money either. When you are an up-and-coming economist trying to gain tenure at a university, the prestige of being associated with the Fed in one way or another is an absolute necessity. According to Jane Darista, a Fed critic and an economist with the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst,
it's very important if you are on a tenure track and don't have tenure to show that you are valued by the Federal Reserve.
Academics that do research, warning of a banking crisis, get told, well, we may have to fire you because our funding was cut by 80% and professors' jobs aren't safe. You have to change your research or we can't have you anymore at the university. And that's quite shocking, isn't it?
At the time, it's only a few academic experts who are willing to concede that there might be some problem with the money system.
So what is the media message? What is the media telling the public? The media tells the public that the problem is that the government is printing too much money. You hear it over and over every day on the news. But it's not.
We aren't printing money. We are borrowing every dollar into existence.
So isn't the media supposed to be the keepers of the public interest, the fourth estate? Not anymore. Here's a story I was told a couple of years ago. When I released my last documentary, The Secret of Oz, at the end of 2009, I sent it to 2 friends of mine in the media. They worked at one of the big 3 U.S. networks. After viewing the film, they called me and said, "This is great." I was puzzled. I'd expected that they would dismiss it as some sort of economic conspiracy theory. but they told me that they had just been laid off with 100 other network executives because of J.P. Morgan. I asked what J.P. Morgan had to do with the network, and they said that the networks are so heavily in debt to Morgan that every time loans come due, J.P. Morgan efficiency experts make demands on what the network has to do to have its loans renewed. What would be the price for non-compliance? The network would be out of business in a single week. So it's just like the average American homeowner. They are all mortgaged to the max to banks. Anything the bank says, they have to do. Just as the Bible says in Proverbs.
Just as the rich rule over the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender.
So do you really have to ask why the general public is confused? If our politicians can't tell us the truth, and the media can't dare to tell us the truth, then even the professors can't tell us the truth. What is the average person supposed to believe, and how can they ever discover the truth, much less sort it out from the conflicting diversions?
Clearly there seems to be this belief among economists that a complex theory, lots of abstract mathematics, is intellectually superior to a simple argument. The truth couldn't be further from it, because it's a fundamental principle in logic known to Aristotle and William of Ockham, who said a simple argument beats a complex argument.
So what do we do about this? Fortunately, the solution is easy to understand, and it's basically the same for every nation on earth. All monetary reformers agree that fractional reserve lending is nothing but outright theft and must be stopped.
I cannot see why the banking sector should have the privilege of creating money and the government being forced to borrow from the banks at interest.
At some point, this system absolutely must collapse into a titanic pile of bankruptcies and poverty for the masses, and all the real assets will be owned by the banks and their stockholders. How should money be created? First of all, government should create all the money it needs to operate debt-free. Inflation should be monitored closely, and if too much money is created and prices start to edge up, then money is taken out of the system by taxation. So then the question is, are we trying to create some impossible social utopia? No. Another responsibility of government, once basic needs are met, is to stimulate individual productivity. This can be done by making sufficient money available to the banking section so that they can lend money to anyone who works hard, repays their debts, and has a good idea. Then each person can decide whether they wish to live modestly or whether they want to try to better themselves through working hard and creating products and services the world needs. National money would be sold by the nation's treasury to banks. It would be a simple transaction. Let's say $100 would be sold to a bank for $101. Banks would then tack on their own initiation fee and lend it out to people. The question is, should the national treasury lend out to the people directly? Probably not. You probably want to create competition among commercial banks for the commercial lending business. That will foster competition and ensure that Treasury cannot deny a person a loan because they don't like their politics. All money reformers agree on certain basic principles. Number one, forbid national borrowing.
It just doesn't make any sense at all that a government should have to borrow something for which they own the patent and have the right to produce themselves.
So a nation state, why should it not, in the public interest, create its own debt-free, persistently circulating money supply? Why not?
Sovereign nations do not have to borrow. The borrower becomes servant to the lender. And in the case of nations, the lenders are usually the biggest banks or related financial institutions. Number two, all nations need to issue their own debt-free sovereign currency once again and put an end to consolidated currencies like the euro. Nations can create enough of their own national money to serve the public interest. The argument against this is that it will cause hyperinflation. Not if you control the quantity. If controlling the quantity is the only thing we have to do to get out of this mess, don't you think we can find somebody to do that? Here's my axiom. It matters not what backs the money. All that matters is who controls the quantity. Will you be in control of the quantity in the public interest, or will you give that power up again to bankers who will, by definition, have to maximize profits for their corporation? Right now, the money power has taken over government. The solution is not to give up on government. Our only option is to fight to take government back, to make it serve the public interest. And the most important weapon to break out of the debt money system is to forbid government borrowing. Number 3, forbid fractional reserve lending. We need banks. They provide useful services that people need and are willing to pay for. The money masters have ruled this planet for thousands of years through serfdom and slavery. Humanity's answer to this problem has been to institute self-governance. That's been the cornerstone of humans' march into freedom. The problem is that the money masters have learned how to recapture the most important power of self-governance while leaving the shell to make it look like we are still free, but we're not. Until we learn that the root of our freedom problem is government borrowing, we will never return to true government of, by, and for the people. Why should a government borrow when it can create its own money?
And in the United States, this is the 100th anniversary of that Federal Reserve System, which has been nothing but trouble. And this is a year when the American people could give themselves the most wonderful present ever to get rid of it.
It's just that simple. You can understand this problem and fix it.
In conclusion, it has become painfully obvious, even for me, a 12-year-old Canadian, that we are being defrauded and robbed by the banking system and a complicit government. What will we do to stop this crime? What will we do to ensure that the next generation will live free and clear of the debt-based economy that enslaves them to the banks? Margaret Mead said the following, and I hope that all of you remember this. Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.